Dr. Rajeswari Pillai Rajagopalan is the director of the Center for Security, Strategy and Technology at India's leading think tank, the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi. And earlier, she served in the National Security Council Secretariat of the Indian Prime Minister's office. We also have with us J. Panda, a well-known name in India, Member of Parliament and the National Vice President of India's ruling Bharatiya Janata Party. In his earlier career, corporate career, Jay Panda was active in business groupings. Dr. Rajagopalan and Jay Panda, both of you have heard what Sir Ian has said in terms of the UK-China relationship and his perspective that the nature of the balance that the British government currently has with China is definitely not the right one. In a similar manner, let me ask both of you whether you think that India has got the balance right between security and trade with China. And the reason I ask this is that following India's worst border clash with China in the summer of 2020, India's non-military punitive measures really focused on banning software companies, the Chinese, cancelled some rail and road tenders, but did nothing to really address some of the issues of the trade deficit, which is increasing with China, where China continues to remain India's largest trading partner. So perhaps let me ask Dr. Rajagopalan first to respond, and then Jay Panda.
Thank you, Rahul. And I agree entirely with Sir Ian on his perception on how we manage China. Of course, dealing with China has not been a straightforward issue, especially given the trade and economic dependence that India, like other countries, have developed vis-a-vis China. But China's behavior in the last few years, its tendency to use force, the threat of force, use of trade and economic coercive practices, all of these have altered the perceptions of many states, including India. But like you said, it's not been easy, and there are serious concerns today about the strategic consequences of Chinese power. And accordingly, I believe, there's a greater recognition that the China challenge needs to be confronted directly. So despite the reluctance and the tendency to sit on the fence or not take sides between China and the US, for instance, India, I think, like to many other countries, are recognizing that there is no middle path to dealing with China, and hedging cannot be an effective policy response. And I think that's becoming very clear across the board, across the Indo-Pacific region. Therefore, even as India looks for some semblance of normalcy in our bilateral engagements between India and China, India is also mindful of the need to work with others in managing China's growing power and its belligerent behavior. And this comes from two necessities very quickly. One is the fact that there is a reluctance, of course, on the part of countries like India also to bandwagon against China. But at the same time, more countries like India are perceiving that it is a necessary cause of China's behavior, including the trade coercive practices. And therefore, there is a need to collaborate with other countries in a sense. Second necessity comes from the fact that no one country can handle China on its own. Again, bringing out the need to collaborate and cooperate with other countries. China has grown enormously over the last decade, and that no one single power, maybe with the exception of the US, can handle China on its own. And this has again pushed more countries. So in a sense, do I find a way of balancing economic and trade, economic and security interests? Not entirely. It has not been easy given the kind of economic dependency, but the necessity is becoming clearer every single day, and countries are beginning to fashion their strategies, including India, based on those security and strategic stability dynamics in the Indo-Pacific and for India directly.
Thank you. Jay Panda.
Let's see things in context. The disappointment with China that Sir Ian was talking about, in other words, the welcoming of it into the global fold, which didn't pan out as expected, is not a new story. If you look at the last 4 decades, this was already becoming apparent by the turn of the century. I, for 15 years in the Indian Parliament, chaired the India-US Forum of Parliamentarians. And in dozens of Track 2 events, in the first decade of this century, this was the 800-pound gorilla in the room that nobody spoke about directly except in hushed tones. But in the second decade of this century, It's now come out in the open and everybody is speaking about it, especially since the pandemic. I think the cover's been blown completely. So, in the last few months, the White House report, the UK itself has called for serious concerns over China's wolf warrior diplomacy. The EU has labeled China as a systemic rival. And we in India, of course, have had this clash in Ladakh. Now, on our side too, we had a situation for nearly half a century where there was no gunfire. There was occasionally physical shoving across the LAC, but no gunfire. And suddenly, you had not only gunfire, but you had a number of deaths of Indian soldiers and also Chinese. We have one factor that perhaps the UK isn't subject to, is that we have thousands of kilometers of border with China. So we have to keep that in context. Other nations like the US can sometimes pivot to Asia, sometimes not. We don't have the option of not pivoting to the situation in this part of the world, including China. So considering all this, if you look at what India has done, I think we have, in the circumstances, we have managed the balance quite well. Under Prime Minister Modi, India has activated the Quad in a way that had not been felt possible just a few years ago. And the naval exercises with not just the Quad, but with others like Singapore and others are one clear measure. The way India has beefed up our border infrastructure, the way we have taken steps. You mentioned about economic steps against China. More than 150 Chinese apps have been banned because of ulterior motives. And you're right about the deficit. I think we will overcome that. The way the Indian economy is booming, it is set to be the fastest growing economy among large economies this year, as per the IMF. These are all factors that bode well. And I echo the earlier thought that, if there are non-strategic areas, if China wants to help build our massive expansion in expressways, roads, perhaps it's something that may not be such a problem. But in our telecom industry, in our in other strategic sectors, defense is being opened up in a very big way to the private sector. Obviously, there would be very serious concerns. So as of now, I think the balance has been managed quite well. But this is an ever-evolving situation. We'll have to be alert and make sure that we stay on top of maintaining this balance in each of the coming years.
Thank you. I think all three of you have really talked about the sort of multilateral approach towards dealing with China, whether it's Quad, whether it's getting other countries involved in this, whether it is the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China. And I think that, we've seen since the integrated review, a convergence of interests between India and the UK in relation to China, especially in terms of some of the economic measures that both countries have carried out. For example, the UK has banned Chinese companies from its fifth generation communication networks, is seeking to exclude Chinese companies from nuclear power plants, and legislation has been introduced to make it harder for foreign investors to take significant stakes in what we had talked about earlier in non-strategic areas of infrastructure. India, at the same time, has also banned Chinese companies for trials for the fifth generation mobile internet technology, and public sector contract bidders require conditional approval by India's foreign and home ministries. In this new arena of convergence, independently between India and UK in relation to China, what more can India and the UK do bilaterally in economic terms in this respect? Let me start with Sir Ian and then Rajay Panda and Dr. Rajagopalan.
Well, I would love to have India join IPAC. At the moment, we've failed to. We've got 21 countries members of IPAC, and the missing link at the moment is India. So I would hopefully encourage India to have a co-chair in IPAC, because we are from Japan to the United States. We have a whole string of countries now, and this process allows us to put pressure on countries to change their political position with regards to the nature of what China does. The second thing I would think is that right now, my general view is that India, there's a real opportunity here for India, because what I was saying earlier on about we need to reduce our dependency on China for so many of the goods and services that are provided. But I do see that this gives an opportunity for us to invest in India to replace a lot of that. In other words, India could be right on the cusp, potentially, to be an serious economic competitor to China, which is very important strategically because India is in a very strategically important place. I also believe that we have to rethink where we are strategically. I personally want the UK to be much more engaged now, and I think this is the general policy, and shift into Southeast Asia and much more re-establishing our links, which we in many senses kind of pulled back a bit from when we were members of the European Union. Now I think we have the opportunity to be back out there, and you know, I want to see us in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I want to see us with improving trade relationships with India and to become a very strong partner together. Because, you know, both as democracies with the rule of law and a sense of human rights, these things are important features which are completely missing in China. So I think the potential for India is enormous now, as I and others put pressure on Britain and the other members of the free world to shift our investment strategies so that we can use countries like India much more than China.
Thank you. Jay, and then Dr. Rajagopalan.
I think there are a number of areas in which there are complementarities between the UK and India, especially concerning the topic that we've been talking about. The UK has changed fairly dramatically in the last 4 years after Brexit. Now, so has India. So India transitioned first into becoming the largest procurer of defense equipment in the world over several years. Now, this was quite a challenge because we had to broad base our sources, and countries like the US, which had restrictions on allowing certain technologies to India, it took a while for that to be overcome. But they were, and today, you know, we've crossed a milestone of $20 billion of acquisitions from the US. There's similar things happening with France and other nations away from our traditional sources. Now, India is now shifting already into the next phase, which is to make in India, to have defense partnerships for production in India with the private sector involved, and major changes are taking place. And this is where the UK has specific advantages. It has technologies, it has equipment, and there are opportunities for the UK to partner with India in this very, very large market. That's also a strategic issue. And of course, although we work in parallel groups, they are towards the same objective. What the Quad is doing is very similar to what this new grouping that AUKUS is doing, with a more military component to it. So I think there are many ways that we can look at, you know, I haven't even touched upon sectors such as education and other areas where India and the UK should be leveraging our mutual strengths and complementarities.
Rajagopalan.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not an economist, but again, trade and investment, I believe, needs to be looked at through a strategic lens. So even though both India and the UK haven't gone very far with the free trade agreement negotiations, again, restarting very soon, but I think the two appeared quite hopeful for an interim deal in the meantime, because I think, especially since India pulled out of the RCEP deal, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership deal, more than a year ago, there is a recognition that India needs to pursue more of bilateral arrangements, including the FTAs. So in a sense, even now, very recently, India, after being stalled for a while, India started the negotiations with Australia. Again, given the strategic convergence, the convergence of strategic interests, both countries are willing to make some compromises, adopt, take on positions that are somewhat more conciliatory, but at the same time, without losing the core of the interest in a sense. So there are possibilities, and I think this is going to happen. But I think while these are important aspects, I would also add that we need to look at the new and emerging areas of collaboration among a number of Indo-Pacific countries, including issues like protection of critical infrastructure, the need to work together on ensuring secure and diverse supply chain, especially those for computer chips, large capacity batteries, active pharmaceutical ingredients, and so on and so critical minerals. And these are important because these essentially push our economic agenda, because our modern economies are so dependent on that. We have seen the vulnerabilities, especially over the last few years, last couple of years, our excessive dependency on a single source, China, and what that means to us. So I think this is an important area that for all of us to look at. But again, over the last year, there have been several significant efforts to move out of China, shift businesses out of China. But India has not really benefited a huge deal. Vietnam has gone on to benefit a great deal. Even though India's overall the ease of business index has gone up, and we have improved on that particular score, the market access, there are some still certain impediments. The bureaucratic and institutional hurdles still come in the way of making effective changes, in a sense, in our system. So I think we need to start opening up in that sense, and I think that's an important agenda, because I think that's a common shared destiny that we want to see. This kind of prosperous, stable, secure Indo-Pacific, if we want to see, and managing China, the supply chains, resilience, these are important issues that we need to be paying attention to, in addition to the bilateral trade in goods and services.
Thank you. We have less than 3.5 minutes, so I have just time for one last question. I'd be grateful if all of you could be brief in your responses. And this brings in what Jay Panda had talked about, AUKUS. And as we speak, we have the UK's second largest aircraft carrier, the Queen Elizabeth, in the waters off the Bay of Bengal, streaming towards Mumbai while carrying out complex exercises with the Indian Armed Forces. And of course, AUKUS, a new security grouping of Australia, the UK, and the US, has recently been formed in the Indo-Pacific region. India, at the same time, has raised its own profile in the Indian Ocean as a net security provider. My last question to all of you, with brief responses, is what more can India and the UK do together on defense and security to enhance mutual capabilities? Let me start with Dr. Rajagopalan, Jay Panda, and we'll end with Sir Ian.
Okay, so quick bullet points on what India and the UK can do together. Of course, the service to service military exercises has been an important dimension of our collaboration, but I would say we could take it to the next level, including tri-service exercises that would strengthen the sophistication and the complexities of the maneuvers involved. Second is to look at an action-packed agenda around the maritime domain. Of course, there is a precedent in terms of done on a much smaller scale, where India has partnered with other countries on anti-piracy operations. But and this, of course, saw China's participation. But cooperating with partners to deal with the enormous security challenge posed by China in the Indo-Pacific, and creating a larger political coalition, in a sense, whether it is the relationship between groups like the AUKUS and the Quad and the many number of other minilaterals and trilaterals that happen in the region. That is an important position, and because that would actually bring together, in a sense, some sort of a pressure on China, while the defense and security is somewhat narrow. But I think the political coalition that need to take on positions when, for instance, call out China's bad behavior, these are important. But let me stop there on account of time. Thank you so much.
Mr. Panda.
Since I broadly answered this question, I'll just extend it very little. I've already spoken about defense partnership potential. I think on a broader platform, the UK and India could work on UN Security Council reform, for instance, or the danger posed by the large number of countries which have taken BRI funding from China. And there are at least 8 of them, including Mongolia, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, who are heading towards having almost half of their external debt owed to China in a non-viable economic investment. These are areas that UK and India can and should work together to preempt the crisis that is likely to erupt.
Thank you. So, yeah, the British Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, is in India today. Clearly, on foreign and security, there are discussions that are taking place. But if there's one thing on defense and security that you would recommend, what would it be?
Well, I have 2 and very simple.
Okay.
Number 1, I would like the UK to eventually be part of what is now called the Quad, become the quintet or whatever we wanted to call it. I think that's an ambition that Britain should have. It's obviously up to India and the others. And the second thing I would do, send a very big signal, I would like the UK and India to work together so that there is a permanent port facility for the Royal Navy where they would base their ships in India, for operations, constructive operations around there. So a base that was used at permission, obviously, by India, so the Navy was there permanently, showing a permanent presence in the Pacific region.
Well, thank you. A bold suggestion, a recommendation, and we have to end with that. But just, I think, to reiterate that there are clear challenges in dealing with China, but there are convergences that have evolved between India and the UK in relation to China, economically at least, and possibly in some manner on the defense and security front. But obviously, there needs to be greater focus and greater cooperation between India and the UK in looking at China and seeking a response towards China's assertion and in the region, but also its own challenge, China's challenge to the global economic system. So with that, I'd like to thank all three panelists, Ian, Jay Panda in Delhi, and Dr. Rajeswari Rajagopalan for a fascinating discussion. Thank you all.